so that we can have also you present. Okay, so hi everyone. This is our before last iCog meeting. We have another one tomorrow, and then we are taking a bit of a break in July. So we get maybe to enjoy a bit of summer. So today's lecturer is Frank Förster. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire. And prior to taking up this position, he was a postdoctoral research assistant at the Center of Advanced Robotics in Queen Mary University in London. He was working on the project Intuitive Human-Robot Interaction in Work Environments, sponsored by the Alan Turing Institute. And he was a research fellow in the HRI BioSci project at the University of Hertfordshire, as well as PDRA, which is the postdoctoral research assistant within the EU Reverie project and Queen Mary. Frank's PhD has focused on the acquisition of linguistic negation based on linguistically unconstrained interaction of human-robot dyads within the EU iCog project. Following the constructive approach in developmental robotics, this work has been both an attempt to shed light onto some of the mechanisms at play in human language development, as well as an attempt to equip robots with the ability to engage in negation. And Frank's talk today will be also on the topic of language, so interactional regularities in asymmetric dyads, the missing substrate for language acquisition. Thank you, Frank. I will now mute myself and also the rest of the participants. And if you have questions during the talk, you can write them in the chat. And then after Frank's talk, you can also ask them live. Thank you, everyone.
All right. I mean, many of you know me and have probably seen the first part of this talk already. And I must already apologize. I was planning for this talk to have an additional analysis ready, which I don't have. So we'll have to skip one part that should have been here. Yeah, so today, first part A, many of you will have seen. I've presented this on ICDL last year. It's based on a journal publication, and it's basically a summary of the PhD work I did back in, well, 7-8 years ago. Afterwards, in the second section, this is kind of a new bit, I'm going to focus a bit on intent interpretations, which are important, well, let's call it concept or an important mechanism within which we discovered kind of in that work, but I think it's a bit more general than just kind of bound to negation. And then in part D, I'm going to kind of speculate why, you know, how do you go forward from here? Or how could you utilize this in the future? And part C, as you can see, is struck through. That's because, yeah, this is what I wanted to do, a much more detailed temporal analysis of the data I have, but I simply didn't find the time because I'm still teaching in the summer. So unfortunately, I didn't find the time to do this analysis. Okay, so first part is yeah, on these studies on linguistic acquisition of negation. So I do assume that most of you know it, but I'm going to kind of summarize it. So the purpose of these studies was to find out where negation originates. And with negation, I mean linguistic negation. So in English, this is by and large the word no. How do toddlers learn to say no? Where does it come from, the word? So and that means I was focusing on the lexicon. I didn't focus on, I didn't go into grammar. I mean, there's also grammatical versions of negation, but I didn't look into those at all because the reasoning was first you need to know the words before you can engage in any kind of grammar. So words first, basically. In these studies, we used what has been called a constructive approach. I mean, there are papers on this where the idea is basically that we use robots and human-robot interaction as a tool to, well, on one hand, understand human development better, but on the other hand, also develop technologies that, well, equip robots with capabilities that they otherwise wouldn't have. So we have this kind of this dual approach. On one hand, we want to improve robots. On the other hand, we want to understand our own development better, our own psychological mechanisms that are at play. One important other notion in this is symbol grounding. I mean, symbol grounding has become more popular, is my impression, in the last 5-6 years, because the vision and dialogue systems communities have picked up on it. But at least as far as I know, the kind of work on this originates basically in developmental robotics. At least the literature I read back then was all in that field. Nowadays, you find a lot more if you look into vision and dialogue systems. I mean, DeepMind has a project working on this using simulated environments. But so the idea is that we somehow equip robots with the capability of attaching meaning to linguistic units using their sensory motor embodiment, basically. And the question is then, well, we know roughly how to do this with kind of what I call referential words, meaning words that can be seen to refer to external objects and events, you know, dogs, cats, vases, cars, whatever. However, we don't know how we can, or whether we should, or ground symbols for abstract words. And there are abstract symbols of two kinds. There are abstract words that are basically just more general categories of words that are otherwise groundable. So, for example, the word, for example, put could refer to different concrete activities, and you can then basically ground these more concrete words and then derive put from it. I think there was actually work at the IIT. I think I read a paper on that. So that's abstract in the sense that there are categories that are basically based on something that is groundable, but they are kind of a bit more general than that. And you can then implement this by having kind of these more abstract words basically riding piggyback on the other ones. However, there are also abstract words, or what could be seen as abstract words, that are not of that kind, so that are in principle not clear whether they are groundable or should be grounded. And negation words such as no are, or at least I conceive them as one of these kind of words. Other such words would be, for example, words involving volition, I want something, or emotion words. So the question is, should they be grounded in some other state of the agent similar to these kind of referential words, or do they not work that way, basically? And my basic assumption was in the PhD that yes, they should be grounded, but obviously couldn't be grounded in some external entity, because that's not what how this word works. So if you read, I mean, much of this is slightly old now, so I'm not sure if I haven't come across any new theories on this, I must say, but there might be some. But one of the basic, I would say, dominant theories in language acquisition comes from Michael Tomasello, and there the kind of central concept of language acquisition is so-called joint attentional frame. So there the idea is basically we don't learn words just in the void. So I mean, there have been studies, you can put children in front of a TV, just passive exposure to language will not lead to them learning language. That's not how it works, basically. Joint attentional frames are a construct that literally consists of at least, well, 3 entities. You have a child, you have an adult, or usually an adult, it could be some caretaker, more generally speaking, and we have an external object that both attend to, they both know from each other that they are attending to it, and they're basically talking about this. So they're talking about an external entity or event, and they join, they share attention. So this is basically in a very rough description of a so-called joint attentional frame, and this is where language acquisition takes place, not by passive exposure. Now, the problem with this is if you try to apply this to negation, you run into a problem, because obviously there is not necessarily an external referent, or it's not clear if there would be one, what that would be. So there is not too much work on the acquisition of negation words. I mean, there are some some studies that chart when children produce what kind of words, so more or less the kind of order of development, but there are I haven't found any modern studies back then on kind of that would hypothesize the mechanisms behind it, how they learn them. I had to go way back in the literature to find kind of hypotheses of that kind of try to explain the mechanism. And so I found basically 2 hypotheses, and these two hypotheses were then translated into experiments. The first hypothesis was formulated by a guy called Spitz, which was a psychoanalyst in the 1950s, who thought, well, basically the earliest negation words that children produce have their root in what parental prohibition. So the basic idea there is that parents prohibit their children from engaging in dangerous things, saying putting the finger in the electric socket or something like that. But the child basically doesn't know about the danger and really wants that kind of thing. The parent really does not want it to have that thing. And this leads to the child's frustration. And odds are that parents will use the word no within these prohibitive actions, so a combination of linguistic action and other actions, and so the hypothesis is that the child starts associating the word no with negative affect that was originally triggered by its frustration from not being able to do what it wants to do, and that it then later on, once it becomes an active user of the word, basically does some kind of role reversal. So there's some kind of So this is from the 1950s, this hypothesis. And then we have one that I found in the 1980s from Roy D.P., the second author. He actually wrote his dissertation on the development of negation. And he refers to Joanna Ryan, who published slightly earlier work on, on child language development. And he formulated the word, and that's kind of one of the key topics today of this talk, of so-called intent interpretations. P in his dissertation did not necessarily formulate this as a hypothesis, as an explicit hypothesis, but he suggested that this could be at the root of negation words. We're going to see. I'm going to show you a video later of children where you see what this looks like. I mean, it sounds maybe complicated, but it really is quite. Once you see it, you know that this is what people do. Basically, the idea is that parent or caretaker expresses a child's expressions, so usually affective expressions or expressions of volition, linguistically. So basically, provides the words for the child. So the child is in some negative state, for example, but I will show you this also applies a bit to the positive side. But in this work, I focused on negation and hence on the kind of negative effect. So in this case, the idea is you have a child that is, for whatever reason, in a negative state, does not want something, does not feel like some certain thing, for example, food. And the parent then provides a linguistic expression, or that's the words to that stance, basically. And this happens in a very close temporal time frame. And so this is the kind of second hypothesis, that these earliest negation words from children came from these negative intent interpretations. Now you should note these two hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. They could both apply. And the other thing that is important here is both are linked to affect. So both kind of require affect on part of the learner. So in the first case, there needs to be affect in order for the agent to be frustrated. You know, if you're not frustrated, you couldn't possibly associate negative affect with that word. In the second case, you also need to have affective states, because this is what triggers the intent interpretation in the first place. Another thing I won't go into now is, so no have can have many different functions. So you wouldn't, if you've never looked into it, you would probably not be surprised how many different functions it can have in communication. But so there is a whole taxonomy what negation, the early negation words mean, and we derived from that another taxonomy for our robot-directed speech, but also for the participant speech. So P's taxonomy that he developed in the 80s was focusing exclusively on children's speech, whereas we needed a taxonomy that also classified our participants' utterances. So we needed to develop basically a taxonomy that was a symmetrical fit to the other one. So basically in these studies, we tried to recreate the conditions of these two hypotheses. So in one case, participants, we equipped the robot with affective expressions, and it internally had also kind of very simple affective state. In order to test what I call is the rejection hypothesis. So this is the hypothesis that these intent interpretations lie at the root of earliest negation words. And in the other condition, we used the first condition plus we added a kind of a prohibition task to it. That meant we declared so certain objects that people were asked to talk about as no-goes, as forbidden, and we had then the robot go for them, so that participants were basically forced to do something about that. And the hope was that they would engage in prohibitive utterances and yeah. I mean, in these studies, we used an iCog robot as the learner, so the replacement for the child, so to speak, and naive participants. Naive participants means we did not use lab colleagues or myself, but we used people who did not know how the algorithm worked. He had not much exposure to robots before, but also who didn't know the true well, they also didn't know the true purpose of the study. So the study was basically built on top of previous studies that we had done in the lab, but that had nothing to do with negation. That were just about grounding words from unconstrained, from the unconstrained language of tutors, basically. So we added basically effective expressions. That was the big difference between what had happened before and what happened in these negation experiments. The rest of the setup was basically identical, but the difference was that the robot showed preferences towards the object, and the robot would be frustrated if you would push its arm away and not have it the thing that it wanted. We use prosodic marking for word extraction. So I mean, if you use unconstrained speech, the question is which words do you actually ground? Which words are the ones that you should ground? I mean, that was already developed by Joe Saunders, my other supervisor. So a kind of, not perfect, but a fairly decent system to kind of extract content words and extract kind of prosodic, what we call prosodically salient words. I'm not going to go into detail what that is, but it's basically a value for, you get a value for each word that tells you how prosodically salient is. So if you pronounce it, if there's a high pitch, if it's very loud, that would be prosodically salient. And we extracted those words, one per utterance. And those were the ones that were then grounded in the robot sensory motor state and also its affective state. So yeah, importantly, only prosodically salient words made up the robot's active vocabulary. So we threw away all the other words of any given utterance. And this is based on properties we know from child-directed speech. So child-directed speech has certain specific properties that differ from regular speech in that there is usually a higher prosody. Words are put at utterance final position. You have yeah, so these kind of heuristics we use to extract words were based on what we know from child-directed speech. And as far as I'm aware, this is the only study that basically combines HRI with developmental robotics in the sense that we use naive participants. And this is important because if you as a developer talk to the machine, obviously you're going to shape the way you talk to the machine to whatever your algorithm can handle. And in that sense, you're not exactly the optimal participant. If you want to test whether it can basically handle natural language input. So this was the overall design. We have a prohibition experiment, rejection experiment. As said, the prohibition experiment is kind of the baseline. I mean, it's not the baseline, but it's the basis for the prohibition experiment. So the prohibition experiment has all the tasks that the rejection experiment has. On top of it, it has this prohibition task. Maybe I should show you the picture first. So this is how it looked. I mean, many of you have seen the videos. So you have basically the iCog here. You have objects on the table between participant and iCog, and they are supposed to, participants are ought to teach these labels, these object labels, and they're unaware that this in our case the study was about negation. They didn't know about this, but the only thing they were told was that the robot has preferences. So it likes certain things, it dislikes others, and certain things it doesn't care about. So this is the kind of don't care about one here. You have here on the upper right, this is the kind of positive one. It holds out its hand. People can put it in its hand. I mean, optimally, I would have wanted it to grasp the objects, but I didn't know how to do that back then. So, and here you see in the lower left, you see an example of the robot not wanting an object, basically turning the head away, frowning. And here in the lower right, you see this is a prohibition task where we ask participants to prohibit, to literally corporally prevent the robot from touching these objects. However, so we showed these two participants how to do this beforehand to kind of take the kind of any fear of touching robot away. However, it turned out that many participants still didn't want to touch or push the robot. They prefer to hold the objects, basically move the objects out of its field of reach, basically. So anyway, this is a study setup. Basically, study consisted of 5 sessions. So each participant came 5 sessions. Each session was 5 minutes long. In the rejection experiment, as said, there was only they were asked to teach the robot about these object labels, and there was this, the robot would either like or not like. So like, dislike, or be neutral about these objects. All objects were allowed. That's what this AAA here means. In the prohibition experiment, there were allowed and prohibited objects. So that was the only difference. And we wanted to see what this does to the kind of speech of our participants. And sessions 4 and 5 were planned to be basically the test sessions. So in session 4 and 5 in the prohibition experiment, the prohibition task was dropped because we wanted to see how the learning success, how it would differ between these 2 experiments. Okay. Yeah, there were 10 participants per, I think I said most of this, 10 participants per experiment, 5 sessions per participant. The robot learned independently per participant, so we didn't lump participant speech together. The robot learned exclusively on the input of a single participant, and that along kind of 5 sessions. So we didn't throw this into one pot, basically. Yeah, learning took place offline. I'm not sure, but that was mostly due to speech recognition being not very good at the time. I mean, it should have improved now, but I'm still not sure if it could handle child-directed speech or something that is similar to child-directed speech. And another reason for offline processing was we did not just kind of transcribe the speech, or we also did this prosodic labeling that was at the basis for the word extraction. And that, again, is quite a, well, fragile process that needs a very clean sound file plus a precise alignment of the kind of transcription. So I mean, my hope would be if this would ever be done again, that this could be done online, but I'm not sure if it actually can, even despite kind of the current progress of speech recognition. Baseline data set. So we use the baseline data set from the previous experiments where the robot did not have these effective expressions, just to see what difference affect would actually make in terms of participant speech. So again, our experiment in terms of instructions was pretty much identical to those before. Participants' task was pretty much identical, with the one exception that I told participants, okay, look, the robot has preferences. I could have maybe not said that, so I had the choice telling them or not telling them, but I thought maybe people don't expect a robot to have preferences, hence I rather mention it. But it's not clear whether that made a difference or not. But that was the only difference, basically, in terms of between these experiments. So I normally show this video, but because this goes on YouTube, I think I'm not allowed. But I show you later a video of actually babies, toddlers, to give you an idea of intent interpretations. But if you want, send me an email. I have it on password protected, so I just can't have it kind of without that on YouTube. So the results basically were quite dramatic. This is one of the reasons why I still kind of keep on going on about this, because these intent interpretations were really surprising. What didn't surprise me were the prohibitive utterances, but what did surprise me were the regularity and the kind of frequency of these intent interpretations. So if you look here, I mean, this is just, so we analyze the data on 3 different levels: on an utterance level, on a corpus level, and on a pragmatic level. Utterance level means you look at, how do your utterances look like? How many words do you have per utterance? What is the kind of, how diverse are they? How many different words are in there? Or, how talkative are your participants? And then we classify the utterances into negative utterances and, well, non-negative ones. So here on the utterance level, you can see there were no significant differences between these three scenarios. So we have the two negation experiments plus the baseline, which is here the Saunders, what I call the Saunders experiment, because it was Joe Saunders who kind of designed this one. There's no significant differences. So participants didn't talk more in our negation experiments than in others. However, you see a massive differences in the negative, in utterances containing negatives. So these were utterances that contain any kind of negation words. No, so kind of lexical negative, or some kind of grammatical negative, don't, not, whatever. There we see a huge difference. As you can see here in the baseline, so in Joe's experiment here, we see, well, there were actually some, but there were not many. Whereas it kind of goes up into 4 to 5 negative utterances per minute within the two negation experiments. Here you see a drop, because this is where basically in session 3 and 4 the prohibition task was taken away. So participants were not asked anymore to. There were basically no forbidden objects anymore, and hence there were no need to engage in prohibitions. That's why you see this drop here. So just so the input changed dramatically. This is the corpus level analysis. So in this analysis, you take all the speech you have, you throw it into one pot, and you just regard it as a one big corpus. So I don't throw anyone anyway. On the right-hand side are the salient words only, because as I mentioned before, our algorithm, the robot would only learn or would only deal with words that were prosodically salient. Anything else would not enter its lexicon. So these are the kind of, in terms of robot learning, the right-hand side is an important one. So what you can see here, I mean, as I said, the focus on this studies was on negation. You can see basically no skyrockets. It goes up. I mean, here it's the 6th most frequent words in the rejection corpus, the 9th most frequent word in the prohibition corpus. Also, don't here is actually on rank 19, whereas in the baseline here, no is on place 50, which is already, actually, I would have thought it's further down even. And then here if you look at salient words only, so those that actually were extracted by our algorithm as to be grounded words that would enter the robot's lexicon, no is on rank 2. So it's the 2nd most frequent word in the rejection corpus and the 4th most frequent word in the prohibition corpus. So on that level, really, we see massive increase in negation words. So that's just the input. And if we look now at the pragmatic level, so what did participants actually do? So what kind of communicative function did those utterances have where they used these negation words? You see, I mean, I don't have time to talk about the taxonomy. So there's a whole taxonomy about this, what kind of negative utterances those are. So by and large, we have, I mean, if you want to chunk it up very roughly, you can say there are truth functional negations that are stuff like, no, this is not a square. And there is what I would call motivational types of negation, which means which refer to the motivational state of the robot. That says stuff like, oh, no, you don't like that, or no, you don't want that. This is what you see here, so-called negative intent interpretations. Negative motivational questions are similar. I mean, I don't have time to go into this. There are anyway, they are kind of, they both refer to the expressions of the robot, to the preferences of the robot, and at that time. And prohibitions are kind of here leading the frequency, not surprisingly, maybe. The other thing you can see here are saliency. What I also packed into the graphics is the saliency rates of these utterances. So you can calculate prosodic saliency by word group. You can also calculate it by the pragmatic type. So depending on what kind of utterances they were, what was the prosodic saliency in them. And I mean, prohibitions, maybe not surprisingly, have a very high prosodic saliency of, I mean, this is often negation word, I have to say. But they're also fairly high in these other here, kind of what I call motivational types. They're not so high in the truth functional types. So stuff like, no, this is not a square, or this is not a circle. The prosodic saliency rate is lower. If we look at it by word type, also prosodic saliency rates are high up for object labels, which is not surprising. We knew that those are kind of things that the robots ought to learn. So they are 70 to 80% prosodically salient. However, we have other words that are actually surprisingly salient, which are emotion words. But also, for example, no has a prosodic saliency rate in the area of 60%. Others, for example, are normally called in linguistic function words, they kind of drop here to the bottom. So you could say this is one of the reasons why you don't hear function words from children. They basically are just not, they don't basically stick out acoustically speaking. And if you throw all of this together, basically what this means is that you end up with a ton of negation words in the robot's active lexicon, meaning that the robot will start uttering these words sooner or later. This is just a statistical comparison. So obviously, yeah, so all I've explained so far was about participant speech. I haven't talked about the robot's learning success yet. So this is about the robot's learning success. Now the question is, and that's actually a problem, a fundamental problem, how do you judge whether a negative utterance is what is called in speech act theory felicitous? That means, is it adequate in that situation, and would it be taken as an utterance of that kind by the recipient, so by the parent in this case? For that you have to basically code. You have to use your own judgment as a speaker of the language. And we had two coders who coded the felicity rate. We also coded the robot's utterances for the pragmatic type. So what we would think if we didn't know, so if we just heard this utterance spoken in context, what would we think that this utterance is meant to do? What was its communicative function? Here, in terms of just felicity rates, so kind of utterances where you would think, yes, this fits, this is, this works, I would take it as what it seems to be. We have in the rejection experiment 74%. That means about 3/4 of the utterances seem to be fitting and adequate. For example, an example for adequate would mean the robot is actually negative, is kind of grumpy about the thing when it says no, rather than smiling and says no. I mean, that would not be fitting, basically. In the prohibition experiment, it drops to 32%, and this was a bit of a surprise. And one of the reasons for this was, as we found out, is that participants, as I mentioned earlier, did actually not engage in this kind of prohibition task. So they didn't move the robots, they didn't push the robot. In other words, if they didn't push the robot, it wouldn't get grumpy. That means it wouldn't be in the kind of required negative affective state such that it could ground the word in that state. So that was kind of an implementation error, that there was only one way in which you could make the robot grumpy, which was by pushing it. We should have actually, if I would have foreseen this, we should have also made it grumpy if it couldn't reach an object, if you put it out of reach. But yeah, this was the reason for this low the success rate here. Anyway, so both these, I mean, based on the data, it looks like both of these hypotheses, both of these hypothetical roots of negation words seem to be good as roots, so we can't really exclude any of them. As said, this problem with the prohibition task was a kind of design error. It wasn't a problem of the input. And yeah, what we could see is that the effective displays of the robot has a massive impact on how people talk to the robot. And another thing I noticed, and that's part of the analysis I couldn't do for this talk, is there is a remarkable temporal alignment between the effective displays and how people interpret them. So they're very tightly coupled. There's not much of a temporal gap between them. So finally, the new stuff, intent interpretations. What are they and what function do they have? So as I said, they took me very much by surprise. I mean, it didn't take me by surprise that people engaged in them, but the strength and the regularity of them, that did surprise me very much. So I'm going to just quickly explain what these are. So intent interpretations are, I found them, you don't find them in modern accounts of language acquisition. I don't know why. I only found it in Roy D. P's work here, who has the only dissertation I'm aware of on this topic. And he attributes it to Joanna Ryan. But funnily enough, if you read Ryan's paper, you don't find it that explicitly. So this is basically P's interpretation of Ryan. But so the idea is basically in Ryan, parents do interpret their children's they interpret their, let's say, the pre-linguistic utterances, the sounds they make. They interpret them as if it was a word or utterance. And they interpret them, yeah, as she says, trying to say something. And this includes intonation patterns, but also other accompaniments, so other kind of affective displays, displays of volition, whatever. If you read the Ryan paper, Ryan discusses this mostly in conjunction with these kind of early vocalizations that are not yet words. P then goes on, makes it a bit more general and says, no, intent interpretations are anything that basically interprets another agent's, well, affective or volitional or intentional state based on their, display. So it doesn't, in P's kind of, or if you want to call it definition, I mean, I don't think he meant it as a definition, but in P's, let's say, conception of this term, there is no necessity for these kind of pre-linguistic or for these utterances before there are words. Okay. And P also says, these are, I mean, we know P's work was on early negation, but he thought it was a bit more general than that, and I do agree there. I think they are more general, in that they are important for any kind of early linguistic expression of intention. So the idea is basically these things, these kind of adaptations, these that parents do when they speak to their children, lie at the root of not just negation words, but maybe also emotion words. So this is kind of how maybe a child learns the meaning of sad, which is by, for example, the parent telling it, oh, are you sad? When it is sad, before it knows the word sad, basically. So these are the examples. I took this from YouTube, so I hope this would be kind of in terms of copyright and so on. Okay, I mean, they were on YouTube. I'm not sure if they still are. But just to give an example. So this is here.
Maria, want some green beans?
Ooh,
so that what you just heard is,
huh?
ooh, no good, huh? That's the intent interpretation. He's basically looking at, I guess, him. I'm not sure if it's a boy, but I mean, this child, I'm pretty sure he or she is pre-linguistic. I mean, based on the age. So, but that what you just heard is, ooh, no good. That's an intent interpretation. And here we have another example, slightly older child.
No. Do you want to do your taxes? I didn't think so. Okay, do you want to sleep early?
Want some water?
No. You want water? No.
So this is another example where you
food?
basically see the parent provides a negative utterance for the overt behavior. I'm not sure if I guess it's a boy, if this boy can actually talk. I mean, he looks old enough that he could in theory, but in this situation he certainly isn't. And it's basically the parent who provides the basically the utterance that normally would be his turn to express. So I try to find positive examples for intent interpretation. I mean, I find them here. So in this paper down here, I mean, it's slightly more general intent interpretations. The analysis I did there was about attributions of autonomy, but on the same corpus. My theory is that attributions of for example, emotion or attributions of volition are basically the same thing as an intent interpretation, slightly more general in the sense that when I did this analysis, I also counted utterances that were not in the here, that didn't make reference to some expression in the here and now, but to some past or future expression. I also counted them as an attribution. Intent interpretations are basically, by their very definition, always make reference to or are triggered by things in the here and now. They're not about past events, they're not about future events, they're about the now. Whereas attributions of agency or attributions of emotions, they're a bit more general. They can be about future and past preferences, for example, but they are, so in that sense, it's a bit of a superset. Here, so instead of having a video, which I'm not sure if I can show, so this is a transcript. This is an example of an intent interpretation or with respect to volition. What you don't see in the transcript, unfortunately, is the robot speech. So this is just the participants' turns. But however, this is the first session. That means the robot didn't speak in that session anyways, because the robot would only learn offline after the first session. It's first. So there were no expression, no linguistic turns on the robot side, but there were emotional expressions. So this participant offers a triangle, says that triangle, looks at the robot, and then says no. So basically interprets the stance. What about this hard side? No, you don't like. So that one. What about squares? Not the square. So this is always, I mean, this should be this notation should be extended, because there are always in between these turns are obviously the robot is doing stuff, showing stuff, behaving. But what you see here are expressions of where the participant basically attributes volition to the robot. And obviously we have here the negation words. We know that they are prosodically very salient, but we also have these other words such as like that are prosodically salient. In the second transcript we have here, this is a bit of an exaggerated one. Exaggerate in the sense this is the fourth session of this participant, and he was, well, I mean, if you would have witnessed the session, you would have realized it is kind of it was slightly playful and exaggerated. So I mean, I think it was the only participant that used the word hate, for example. But in principle, you could call this a attribution of emotion, or also an intent interpretation, a very strong one. But it was meant in a kind of playful manner. So he basically shows the robot stuff. The robot seems kind of indifferent, and he says, you know, you seem indifferent to it actually, but maybe indifferent is too big a word for you at the moment. So it's your favorite. Is this your favorite? Yes, your favorite. And then he changes the object, and your least favorite, your despised, you hate the triangle, hate the triangle. So this is an example of a kind of emotional attribution of emotion, but also at the same time intent interpretation here. And this is an analysis, a corpus kind of level analysis, where I looked at the non-negative words. I wanted to see how many, because before the work all focused on negation, here I wanted to see what is actually, you know, what do we get in terms of non-negative words that seem to be related to these intent interpretations. And there we see, well, top words are like, but like in English often used kind of instead of want. So instead of saying, do you want X, people usually say, do you like? So it is kind of, even though you may think it's an emotion, it's probably an expression of volition. That's why you see here this categorization. Then we have emotional words, happy, sad, smile, and other ones. I mean, I'm not going to go into any detail here. There's also called attributions of autonomy, which is a kind of a category I wouldn't conflate with intent interpretations, but these kind of expressions of volition and emotion by and large coincide with what I call intent interpretations. And the curious thing is, if you compare participants to each other, it doesn't seem to make a difference sometimes whether they say, in terms of the interaction, in terms of the choices they make, whether they use an emotion word such as, are you happy, you know, showing an object, are you happy? Oh no, this object makes you sad. Or whether they use volition words. They use this pretty much, I mean, not interchangeably as a single person, but if you compare participants, they either go for one or the other, but they seem to do the same kind of job within the interaction, so to speak. Yeah, so the interesting bit is here, the reason why I show this is basically by participants. So these are all 30 participants from all 3 experiments. R stands for rejection experiments, P are participants for the prohibition experiment, and B are the baseline ones from Joe Saunders' experiment. And this is now as attributions of emotion, attributions of volition, attributions of autonomy, always linguistic attributions. Maybe not surprisingly, we see something very similar to negation words. We see a ton of attributions in the 2 negation experiments, and we see hardly any in the baseline. However, there is quite a large, let's say, variation between participants. You can see here our participant number 1 hardly engaged in these attributions. And we have one participant down here, B8, which did actually engage in these attributions. So saying stuff like, oh, do you want this? Do you like this? Without there being some kind of effective expression. So the way I interpret this is that if your machine or your agent, whatever it is, manages to give or provoke the impression that it has preferences, or the participants already thinks that to start with without needing some kind of concrete evidence, they do engage in this kind of speech. This is the way I interpret this here, because this went, I think, was throughout all of the 5 sessions, if I remember correctly. So the curious thing is really, this is the one you have to explain, B8, because that participant did engage quite similar to our participants in the negation experiments, did engage in this kind of speech, even though there was no overt display of preference or affect. So as I said, my interpretation is, whatever the reason, once a participant is kind of convinced, though convinced might be the wrong word, but convinced that the agent has preferences, has intention, has emotions, one of these things, participants will engage in this kind of speech. And yeah, so it's a kind of it is kind of unlikely that this will be the case if the robot doesn't give any reason or any kind of trigger for this, but it is possible, as we see here. I mean, this is just a numerical comparison. Not surprisingly, emotion attributions, volition attributions were much, much higher in the negation experiments. This is kind of just mirroring what we saw just for negation words, but a bit more generally. Volition attributions were the highest ones. Would you like, do you want, that kind of thing. And not so much in the baseline. The numbers you see in brackets are the absolute. So again, this is basically thrown all participants, all sessions together. You have absolute numbers here in the brackets, and you have relative frequencies, so attributions per minute in the other number here. And that is it. That is all for the kind of well, in terms of numerical results. The other thing to observe is when I did the analysis for the last sessions to actually decide to whom the attribution is made. Some participants will use expressions such as, we don't like this one. And it could be kind of the royal we version of the royal we, meaning you. But my hypothesis is this actually generally means we. We meaning we're in a situation where basically the participant jointly chooses the next object for the robot, and depending on what the robot shows in terms of what it likes and doesn't like. So I think what we see here is a genuine kind of, this is an actual meant as a we. So basically participant and robot try to agree, or participant tries to agree with the robot on what should be talked about in the next turn, so to speak. So I think what we see here is it's not a problem of kind of, it's not a problem on the analytical level, I think, where you really have a really hard time saying who is this attributed to. I think we generally see here something that is on the level of the dyad, not on the level of the individual participant. So that's my hypothesis. That would need to be borne out by the data much more in much more detail. Then the other, so the question is, what are these intent interpretations? Why do people engage in them? What is the purpose? And my hypothesis is that they basically provide a scaffold for the linguistically incompetent speaker. That means as soon as the child can engage in speech, it can take its turn, but while it cannot, and that's not restricted to a child, that can be an incompetent robot, so to speak, but it could also be an linguistically incompetent foreigner that doesn't speak your language. Someone you meet on the street and who just doesn't talk your language. This could be anyone, so that's why I called it in the title asymmetric dyad. So you have an asymmetry in terms of competence. You have a competent speaker, you have an incompetent one. And so what I think here is that basically the competent speaker provides a scaffold. Because another thing to notice is that obviously many people's passive vocabulary is much better than their active vocabulary. That means maybe there are situations where people cannot express themselves, including children. However, they do perfectly understand if they are being interpreted by someone else. So they understand what you're saying. They're just not able to do it themselves, basically. And in this sense, I think what we see here is a kind of conversational scaffold where, and the other thing that speaks in this favor is that what you don't see in the transcripts due to the kind of way it's transcribed, there are actually gaps. So participants wait for a few hundred milliseconds or a second, and if the robot could have taken its turn but didn't. So in that sense, I think it is basically a scaffold. It's something where they provide an interpretation and the other party has a chance in that point to intervene and say, no, that's not what I mean. That's not what I want. Or let's actually hear the other hypothesis. They are also an overt offering to correct. So they're kind of part of a negotiation process in terms of what are we going to do next? What do we want to do in the next steps? And yeah, this is, I mean, this again, I would have to look at the data into kind of, conversations between, say native speakers and non-native or very poor speakers of a language to see whether we see them occur there. My guess is that you will see them occur there when people interpret the kind of not so competent person's wishes, so to speak. But again, this would need to be borne out by the data. This is a hypothesis at this point. So this was the analysis I wanted to show today, which I didn't have time to, which is the exact temporal relation between the triggering affective display or volitional display, whatever you call it, and the following intent interpretation. I mean, but this is anecdotal. I mean, there is a very, very strong temporal correlation. I mean, very tight temporal relation between them. So there's not much of a gap. Intent interpretation follows pretty much straight away with maybe a few hundred milliseconds, follows the effective display. But again, I need to analyze this. I need to basically provide the proof for this by analyzing the data. Now, what's the point of these intent interpretations? Why are they of any interest? I mean, for language acquisition, it's hopefully pretty obvious why they're of interest, because they basically provide the potential substrate for classes of words that are really not amenable to kind of the mainstream theories in language acquisition. However, I think they're a bit more general than that. So those of you who know Levinson, he used to be, I think he's retired now, I'm not sure, but he used to be the head of the Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen. He coined this word, the interaction engine. So the idea of this is basically language rides piggyback on a more fundamental mechanism which enables us to engage in joint actions and which makes us the social species we are. So the idea is not that language basically is the fundament for this, but language, there is a prerequisite for such a prerequisite that we can engage in language to start with. And he calls these prerequisites in the interaction engine. I mean, the sum of all of those. And the way he describes them is here, as you see here. So he calls it the interaction engine is a set of cognitive abilities and behavioral dispositions that synergistically work together to endow human face-to-face interaction with certain special qualities. So an interaction engine could be constructed of scraps of motivational tendencies, temporal sensitivities, semi-cooperative instincts, ancient ethological facial displays, the capacity to analyze others' actions through mental simulation, and so forth. So he never, at least in this publication, there was a later one which I haven't read from 2019, I think, but he doesn't provide kind of a definitive list that we can kind of go by. But most of these well, things he mentions here do apply to our intent interpretation. So there is certainly motivational tendencies. So there are direct reactions to a motivational display, basically. They are, as I said, I have to provide the evidence, but based on the observations of these interactions, they are temporally very sensitive. They happen pretty much straight away. They don't, participants don't wait 5 seconds. And well, you could say they are semi-cooperative in the sense that the participant tries to kind of figure out what the robot actually wants, or in case of children, what the children wants. And yes, I mean, facial displays, that's the way we implemented it. What we didn't implement is any kind of theory of mind. I think that's what Levinson tries to get here, to capacity to analyze others' actions through mental simulation. So we haven't, that was not implemented in our system at all. But that is probably, if you want to engage in a kind of prolonged interaction where you kind of come up with a joint plan in an interaction, you probably need some form of rudimentary theory of mind. But so in other words, I see intent interpretations as a kind of part of what Levinson calls it, the interaction engine. I'm not sure if it's the central part or if it's a peripheral part, but it basically ticks most of the boxes that he proposes here. What I further would propose here is that basically, I think language, when we speak, it is misconstrued to think of language mostly as a kind of exchange of information. I mean, this is what is happening too, but I think at the more fundamental level, what we do is we basically try to align our volition to each other in some way. And this is what we currently can't do, what we haven't figured out with robots or any form of dialogue systems, whatever, what we haven't figured out yet. We don't know how this, what I call, I mean, for the lack of a better word, grammar of volition, we haven't figured that one out yet. These are the rules that basically govern how we negotiate a joint action, for a better, lack of a better word. And part of this coordination is to kind of find the common goals, to establish common goals, sub-goals, and so on. And I think this is what intent interpretations play into that, but they're probably not in and by themselves sufficient for this. Now, how do we get to this? Now, I mean, I think we can decode, we can get to these rules simply by observing interaction in very close detail, and then by kind of building it into robots, deploying them in interaction, observing the failures, very important, analyzing the failure of these machines, the failure kind of breakdown of interactions, and doing it again. So yeah, that's all from my part. So I'm sorry that I couldn't provide data on the temporal relationship, but I'm pretty sure, but I have to provide the analysis yet. So that's all from my part. And yeah, please do ask questions. And
thank you very much, Frank. It was a very, very nice discussion, even if it's a preliminary, but I think that we're interested to know the analysis of the results. Okay, so if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself, maybe also turn on the camera so we can chat. Frank, in case you want to keep on sharing the slides, that's okay, particularly if people have questions for a specific slide. Otherwise, you can also stop sharing. So let's see how the questions go.
Okay, so maybe me.
Sure, go ahead, Alan.
I always love the term naive participants. So what do you exactly mean by that? Were the instructions for the baseline naive participants and the prohibition rejection groups exactly the same or not?
As said, the difference, they were nearly identical, with the exception that we told them in the negation experiments that the robot would have preferences, and that was simply because I wasn't sure how if I wouldn't tell them that at all, what the reaction would be. But optimally, I would have run this experiment again without giving this instruction. But that's not what the naive refers to. Naive I mean, that would be what psychologists call blind. I mean, normally they talk about double blind. This would be single blind, meaning the participant didn't know the true purpose of the study, but the experimenter knows in which group they're in, basically. However, naive refers here not to that. That's blind, double blind. Naive means that they're not, they don't have knowledge about the internal workings of the system, and they don't know kind of what your expected outcome is. So they kind of can't act in a way to speak in a way that makes it work just in order to kind of please you. I mean, there's also, I think, some bias to please you as an experimenter, or in order kind of to provide the right input for the algorithm. So that's what is meant with naive, not having knowledge of the kind of internal workings of the system.
Yeah, but I'm just curious whether you use, for example, during the introduction to the whole setup, do you use the words robot, or do you refer to the robot as an it, he, she, something
We gave
like
them
that? Anything
gave
that
them-
can bias everything.
Oh yes, no. We did try to bias participants. So the robot had a name called Dici, and we did try to we very, very much try to bias participants because we wanted them to engage in speech in a register very similar to child-directed speech. We wanted to trigger that. However, it's not clear whether, for example, someone who has not had much interaction with children would be able to do that. It's kind of something that you normally, it's a speech register you don't use if you don't interact with very small children. And but we wanted to trigger it. So we told them, please, consider Dici to be a 2-year-old child and speak to it in that way, whatever that means for you. So we did try to bias that. That was, we wanted them to engage in child-directed speech as much as possible.
Maybe a partial solution would be to use a non-anthropomorphic robot, so a Cosmo or something like that, a wheeled robot that can display emotions still, can act, but is not human-like. Oh,
I mean, we wanted very much for them to engage, as if it was a human. We wanted them to be, because what we are testing here is we wanted to basically compare it with data from child-directed speech and from results from developmental psychology. So we wanted to see whether we can exploit these mechanisms or these kind of adaptations that are part of child-directed speech. That was important for our prosodic labeling, for the word extraction. So we didn't try to avoid that, quite the opposite. We tried very hard to get people to speak in that register. So the question was not, can the robot trigger that? That was not the question. We wanted to see, given that type of language, can we exploit it for language acquisition? So yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I have a couple of follow-up actually to Adam's question, which was very, very nice. So did you check if participants, so I don't know if there are people that you recruited internally from the university or if they were external participants. Did you ask them whether they interact with children regularly, whether they are parents?
Yes, we did. So recruitment was from campus and off campus. I didn't recruit people from our lab, but we did recruit like similarly nerdy people from astrophysics. But also, like, my most probably famous participant, the one I like to show in the video, is the woman who works in the refectory, or used to work in the refectory, because she's certainly the most untechnical or unnerdy person. We did ask, yes, but I've actually never cross-correlated the data from the questionnaires. So I actually never evaluated the questionnaires, but yes, we ask questions such as, do you have children? Did you have exposure to children? And
it may be interesting data, to consider.
Yeah,
because the study where we had iCog as where participants were being like in the role of caretaker for iCog, we also asked how parental they feel, how caretaking they feel, and there is a bit of relation in how they treat the robot as a toddler versus just as a robot.
Yeah, Yes, that would be something I would have to actually still analyze. But sometimes it's surprising. Sometimes you think, I had participants where I thought, okay, this is, this is the most nerdy person ever. There's nothing going to come out of this, and they all of a sudden fall into this kind of, all of a sudden become chatty and fall into a register that you haven't seen before. So I don't think there's a kind of 100% kind of correlation, but yeah. Anyway, but I can't. I mean, I would have to analyze or cross correlate basically the questionnaires with the.
So I understood when you say naive that none of them knew how the system behind worked, but had any of them have previous experiments with robots, or were they all naive subjects, first-time subjects?
No, so some had previous experiments with robots. So some had participated in other studies before,
okay, with
other robots, but I mean, some didn't. I don't have percentages, how many of each basically there were, but I mean, that's anecdotal. My impression was it didn't make a huge differences. It was more, some people tend to adopt the robot kind of as a child, or just fall into that role. Others don't. My impression was not that it might have hinged off whether they already had previous experiments, but I can't say for sure. But it was a question we did, again, it was a questionnaire question I did ask, but that I never analyzed.
I will let someone else ask questions, and then I have a couple more.
I have a question. Hey, Frank, how's it going? Sorry, my camera is not working. At the end of your talk, when you were talking about the fact that there's more to speech than conveyance of information and the missing piece of the puzzle, do you have any clues of how to explore finding those missing pieces of the puzzle? Like, how would you set up an experiment to?
As I said, or as I indicated, I think the reason why I came across these intent interpretations was only because, well, first of all, I found them mentioned in the literature, but also, well, by just setting up this, I mean, I kind of stumbled across them, you could say. However, if you take the premise, if you kind of assume that most or much of speech is not there to just kind of exchange information in a kind of dismotivated manner, but that what we typically do with language is kind of coordinate each other, decide what are we going to do next or whatever. I mean, what are we going to, I don't know, how are we going to work together or not, or but basically it has a lot to do with, what do I want, what do you want, and what do we communally at some point then want. So how do we align each other? And so I think the way you can set up an experiment is you basically just create a collaborative setup, or a setup that is amenable, that is kind of well, let's say that conceivably can easily give rise to collaboration, and you then let people just talk and you record it. So that's the first step. I mean, probably there are corpora of interaction that could be analyzed. I'm pretty sure there are. And then you pay attention to what exactly, how do people negotiate this kind of common, how do they arrive at a common plan, a common goal? Because it's a bit of a dance, a bit of a forth and back, and probably there's also quite a variability in terms of personality type, I would guess. I could guess some people are a bit more, theatric than others, or I don't know. I mean, but there is a lot of, it is a bit of a dance. I mean, we know from conversation analysis that we have also these repair mechanisms. That's also kind of a forth and back. So if we misunderstand each other, we roll back a bit and we go ahead again. But this is something you can, if you analyze indeed, I would analyze corpora where there is where people try to arrive at a common goal in great detail, to see how does it work? How does this kind of interplay work? And you can then set it up with robots. You can implement it. I mean, obviously, in the first few attempts will probably fail, I guess, because at the moment we don't have machines that can basically roll back or kind of give in and you know, kind of somehow. So I think the current assumption is, you know, people want something, the robot maybe wants something or doesn't want anything, and that's it. And there's a kind of one shot exchange. Do you want this? Yes. Then that's it. But I think that's not how we usually do this. It's usually a bit more interplay and forth and back, and there is I'm pretty sure there are regularities behind that we don't know yet. So we don't just act randomly. I mean, there is variability, but I'm pretty sure there's also a lot of structure in there. And for example, if you use conversation analytical, conversation analysis, I think you can uncover quite a bit about these, but at the end of the day, you have to then test it, put it on the test, and implement it in a machine. The one problem I see here, the kind of missing bit in the missing bit, is the part about theory of mind. That's probably the hard one, because we have some mechanisms to kind of recognize intent. However, if you want to do this, if you want to, where is it? If you want to analyze others' actions through mental simulation, that is a tricky one. And I think that's probably where we're going to fall at the moment, because you would need some form of theory, a form of theory of mind.
Well, could you like develop like a theory of mind through?
I think you could. You would have to look at a great deal of data to see what are the kind of things people do with each other, and how do they? How is action structured? I mean, there's a whole philosophical branch, philosophy of action, where philosophers try to look into this. This is probably one of the kind of very strong, one of the biggest missing bits currently. This kind of simulation, but I think
this is. Like humans are not 100% accurate with this too.
No.
Right? Yeah.
Oh no, but it doesn't. The beauty of it is you don't have to be 100% accurate. I mean, the whole in conversational, all the repair mechanisms that we know of, they are there for a reason. They are there because we are not 100% accurate, but we have very robust fallback mechanisms where we can basically go back and forth again.
Yep. Awesome. Great. Thanks.
But
thanks
so I can't answer how we implement the theory of mind exactly, but I think you just have to look at interaction very carefully and try implementing it, and then, you know, failing again, trying again. But the beauty of this is that in conversation, we normally make overt, as soon as we encounter failure, we make overt why we think we failed. So what I would expect to see in the data, if you set up an HRI experiment where you have a robot that engages in some form of joint action, joint planning, what I would expect to see is that you create the system, it engages in this thing, and it falls flat, it fails. Pay attention to what participants say when failure occurs, because this is what we see in human interaction. Interactional failure is normally made overt. So it's not something you have to just speculate about. I would really go and look in very great detail. What do your participants say in that moment? What is at odds? What's not working? Why is it that they basically don't arrive at the common goal or whatever?
I get it. Just to make incremental, basically, improvements to whatever.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is to pay close attention, right? I mean, conversational analysis is a very distinct form of analysis. It's like most engineers don't do it. I mean, we have basically two methodologies here. We have the classic kind of experimental psychology type of experiment where you start with a hypothesis and then you run with it, and that's then either validated or not. In conversational analysis, you are a bit more open-minded. Traditionally, you step back and say, okay, let's not take the hypothesis too serious, and let's just look what people. So the point is, people, and this is something I think that we don't do enough in HRI. People will make their interpretation of failure overt. They will express it. So that means, yeah, and this is a distinct kind of methodological. It's a very distinct methodology, conversational. It comes from sociology. It doesn't have the psychological. It doesn't work like your average psychology experiment. So, but bringing these two together will probably help a great deal. But you have to pay attention. What people actually say, and they will say it. I mean, we know it from human conversation. They will make this normally overt.
Yeah, they're giving you the clues versus you having to go and reverse engineer it, basically. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it could be that they don't give you the full information. They probably will give you a clue, and it may then fail for other reasons after that. Once you for whatever reason you failed, if you manage to fix that, you probably will fail then for other reasons. But the hope is you will bit by bit get there at some point.
Yep. Okay, awesome. Thanks for the answer.
Okay, if we have any other questions from the audience, now is the time. Otherwise, I think we can slowly wrap up as it's 5:20 here.
Yeah, it took much longer than I thought.
No, I think there was a very nice discussion, so I don't see it as a problem. Also, it's fitting with all of the other iCog events and their timings. Do we have any other questions? Okay, in that case, I would like to thank Frank again. Thank you very much for the nice presentation. And I hope that, when we have after the summer, maybe the announcement of the results, if you like to do a sequel of the talk, we would be very happy to have you. Okay.
Tell my 500 students.
Oh, here it's less of us, so we're more appreciative. Thank you. Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you.
And you have also everyone else in the chat jumping in. Thank you. Take care and see you all at the next iCog event.